Now, based on the latest news, sitting US President Donald Trump recently said that he was imposing, and I quote, effective, immediate, a 25% tariff on goods from any nation that doing business with Iran, meaning higher prices for American importers of product from dozens of countries, for example, China, India, Russia, Turkey, and more. Now, over the years that we've been paying closer attention to the political uncertainty and also this economic shift in the nation of Iran, but recently, it looks like the nation of Iran made the news headline again. It's not just about this economic uncertainty. It's more about this what we called internal struggles at this moment. And also paying closer attention, and based on the report, there's a possibility that the Iranian regime could fall if U.S. were to step in. The question we need to ask is, under Trump administration, what can we expect at this moment? And if the Iranian regime were to fall, how will the world, and especially the countries such as China, Russia, and many more, should react? Is it time for us to have this peaceful dialogue, or is it too late to save the country? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Professor JAMSHEED CHOKSY. Professor CHOKSY is Distinguished Professor of Iranian and Central Eurasia Studies in the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies. He's the Director of the Inner Asia and Uralic National Resources Center at Indiana University. Well, Professor CHOKSY, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for having me, Will.
Well, again, Professor, such an honor to have you on the show. Again, as I mentioned before, recently you came out with another amazing piece regarding the nation of Iran, which is called "The Iranian Regime Could Fall, but a U.S. Strike Would Prop It Up." Now, Professor CHOKSY, let's get to the question. As I mentioned in the intro, sitting U.S. President Donald Trump announced that 25% tariff on countries that trade with Iran, and especially some of the countries are rather sensitive and crucial at this moment. For example, China, India, and Russia and Turkey. Let's get to the first question, Professor CHOKSY. From your perspective, what does the tariff would signify if President Trump was serious about such rhetoric? Your thoughts?
That's an interesting question, Bill. And the tariffs were announced right after the article that we published in Foreign Affairs came out. President Trump has said that he is going to be, he has threatened that he is going to take action against Iran if killing of protesters continued. When we wrote the piece, the estimate was 600 dead. It is now within less than 24 hours or so, well over 2,400 dead. And so the president has announced these tariffs. The interesting thing about the tariffs, of course, is there are no tariffs that he can impose on Iran because Iran is under economic sanctions. So he can only impose tariffs on countries and even individuals who trade with Iran. The problem with that, of course, is that the price is paid, as you pointed out, by the importer and passed on to the consumer. So essentially, he's putting a tariff on American consumers. But the purpose of that, one could argue, is to make it less incentive to purchase goods from those countries, and therefore indirectly, in a sense, to hurt those countries by imposing tariffs on those who purchase goods from those countries. And you're right, China and India and Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, these are some of the countries that are going to be impacted by the tariffs. Now, will the tariffs prevent these countries from trading? Unclear. Trading with Iran, that's unclear. The tariffs, of course, tend to have a long-term impact, not a short-term impact. And as you pointed out, the crux right now is what is going to happen to the regime. Millions of Iranians are out on the streets. And so they're not concerned about tariffs. The Iranian regime is also not concerned about the tariffs. The question is, what next is the president going to do? And unfortunately, I think the best way to phrase it is in the words of the White House spokesperson, who said only President Trump knows what he is going to do. And that perhaps is one of the greatest issues that we face in our times, is that we have a US president who ultimately acts unilaterally. And so I'm sorry for to be able to not be able to answer that directly for your viewers. Only the president of the United States knows what he's going to do next.
Well, again, Professor, that's the beauty of having the questions for you. It's again, in reality, we don't know what President Trump will do. But again, let's talk about the reality. I want to go back to the article. This is something that you wrote. Again, as we're seeing the current protests around the country, the regime is responding by cutting off the country's internet access, unleashing violence on the citizens, and blaming foreign scapegoats. I want to say, Professor CHOKSY, it's not surprising that we're seeing the current regime unleashing the violence on the citizens, but it is rather stunning. Try to put the blame on the foreign scapegoats. Why is that? And why do you think the regime is trying to find, air quote, a scapegoat in order to proceed the process or continue the spread of the violence? Your thoughts?
And that, I think, is perhaps the greatest weakness of the regime. The protests have nothing to do with anyone outside Iran, whether it is the US or Israel or China or Russia. Listen, the initial spark for the current protests was the very rapid decline of the rial, of the Iranian currency, that fell over 50% in less than 24 hours. It is continued to depreciate because the government is no longer able to maintain the subsidies that it provided for the basics of life, whether it is rice or meat or cooking oil. The basic food items had been subsidized for a long time. Iran is no longer able to economically maintain that. They had to revert back to free market prices. And then what they attempted to do was to increase the cash subsidy. But in so doing, of course, they don't have the money to cover that either. So the financial situation deteriorated very rapidly in 24 hours or less. The other factors have been building. The affordability of housing. The Iranian Statistical Center, so the government's own statistical arms, have estimated that the average Iranian would have to save up for more than 100 years to be able to afford a modest apartment. That is, you have to save up for more than your lifetime to be able to purchase an apartment. The other major crisis that Iran has faced is they've not managed their environment. And as climate change is occurring, we have seen that water to all the major cities, so drinkable water, not just water to wash clothes and cooking utensils, etc., but drinkable water is in such short supply that the government is talking about physically moving the capital of Iran down to the southern coast. In other words, the issues have become unmanageable. And the other remarkable thing in the current situation is, for the first time, we're seeing cracks in the regime. The supreme leader continues to blame foreigners. But the president acknowledges that it is internal issues and that they're so bad, the president has said, look, if anyone else can do something about it, do it. I cannot, don't blame me. So I think we're beginning to see those were the factors that led to the protests. So the realities of life, the fact that you cannot afford housing, you cannot afford food, you cannot afford fuel, you cannot find water. Those are the things that have led to the protests. And all the blaming of foreigners isn't going to change that.
Professor CHOKSY, I want to talk about another crucial part. Again, you mentioned the crumbling infrastructure and also this outdated equipment. Again, those crucial elements that you mentioned in your article. But there's another significant and unique perspective you cover in the article. This is what you wrote, and I quote, "A shadow economy has flourished as the formal economy has stalled, but the benefits of commodity struggling and human trafficking disproportionately flow to elites because of judicial corruption." Two things that I have to be honest, the Professor CHOKSY, aren't very unfamiliar to all of us. Number one is the human trafficking disproportionately flow to the elites, and also the second part is the judicial corruption. Let's talk about the judicial corruption for a second. Why is it critical at this moment for you as an expert to bring this on the table? And also, under the current regime, what does that mean when we say judicial corruption? Let's start from there.
So let's start from there. What essentially has happened is that as the government has attempted to artificially float the economy, the economic realities have come into play, which means that goods are being brought in to the country and sold at market prices, as opposed to the items that are imported by the government that are then subsidized. Since the government cannot afford to subsidize it, much of what comes into the country and much what circulates in the country circulates beyond the government's economic scope. However, it is government officials who control the economic networks, the transportation, etc. And so they benefit from the shadow illicit economy that is at play. And of course, since that is illegal, it then requires bribery, corruption of other officials, including in the judiciary. So let us say an illegal shipment of clothing or food items, in others items that have not been paid, that customs duty has not been paid, that are then now going to be sold on the open market. Those, if that's intercepted by the police or brought to trial, that's the judicial corruption that has become rampant in Iran. And of course, the people who benefit from it are not the consumer. It is those who control the supply lines, the import lines, and then those who have to adjudicate the legal issues. So that's where corruption has taken hold in the government. And the estimate is that at least a third of Iran's economy is the shadow economy. The result, of course, is that the people who pay the price are the average Iranian citizen who have to essentially, shall we say, subsidize what the government cannot handle.
Professor CHOKSY, let's bring China into our conversation. Again, I remember last year distinctively that you and I, we had several discussions regarding this diplomatic and also this trade relationship between Iran and China. Of course, that we know that in the year of 2026, everyone is very concerned about U.S. and China relationship, especially we talk about the economy. But again, going back to the matter of Iran, something else you mentioned is regarding Iran's natural resources. We know that for China, for a fact, under the Belt and Road Initiative, natural resources are one of the most valuable or irreplaceable commodities for China in order to grow economically or politically. So from your perspective, how attractive are the natural resources to China for Iran? And also, based on what President Trump's announcement, how do you think that China is going to react in terms of this collaboration? China needs Iran. Iran seeking actively for partnership with China. But again, U.S. is not going to be quiet, or to be precise, Donald Trump is not going to be quiet. So how should we understand this joint effort when we look at the natural resources, the benefits for both China and Iran? Your thoughts?
At this point, essentially, I would argue that increasingly, particularly since the end of December, in these last couple of weeks, there is no benefit at all to China from Iran's natural resources. Whatever oil and gas was already on the way to China will continue to China. However, with the entirety of Iran essentially up in flames, the protests are in every city, in every town, in every village, every oil refinery. At this point, the trade with China, the trade that is already on its way, will continue, but there will be no new trade, not because of the United States. So in a sense, you can almost argue that Trump can put these tariffs, but the tariffs are going to be irrelevant because none of these countries are going to be able to trade with Iran at the present time because the Iranian government that controls the trade is essentially attempting to put down protests. There's no transportation of commodities to be able to export them. So in a sense, you can almost argue that the tariffs are symbolic, but the reality for China, for India, the two countries most dependent on Iranian petroleum, is that you're not going to see any further petroleum exports because petroleum production has stopped. The people are protesting. The military is out shooting the people. So essentially, Iran has descended into chaos. And there is, in a real sense, very little that any country, even the United States, can do on the ground in Iran.
Professor CHOKSY, let's talk about another perspective in your article. You wrote that the current Iranian regime is now in a catch-22. The leader understands that opening Iran's market and society enough to fix the economic problem will speed the end of the rule. So the leader and some other hardline leaders have resorted to blame alleged external instigators. We want to know that, again, even though you mentioned about, Israel, Washington, and also the United Kingdom, but why blaming the external instigators? I mean, again, it's 100%, especially from other perspective, it's internal, domestic chaos. Why bring the foreign instigators or so-called foreign instigators into the conversation? Is that, again, you're the expert, Professor CHOKSY, is that a distraction for the world to look at this moment? Or this is really the reality gradually start to come out, and then eventually people say, oh, it's not really the internal affairs. It's actually the external interference from the foreign affairs. What do you think?
And you see, the supreme leader, instead of ultimately addressing the issues, is returning to the standard tropes that he has used always. That is, let's blame the United States, let's blame Britain. Now, the United States does not control the price of Iranian goods. It does not control the economic inefficiencies. The Supreme, and we can see how this rhetoric has failed because it has not quieted the streets. People are not on the streets blaming the United States. They're not on the streets blaming China. They're not blaming any country. They're blaming the supreme leader. They're chanting death to the dictator, meaning the supreme leader. They're chanting anti-regime slogans because they know where the problem lies. I think this shows, in a sense, that the regime has really reached, shall we say, an intellectual bankruptcy, that it keeps going back to these old issues. One can blame the United States reimposing the Shah in 1953, but 1953 is a long time ago. The last Shah is gone. So bringing that up is irrelevant. The Shah's son lives in the United States, but the Shah's son is not on the ground in Iran. He does not have, we wrote, much organizational capacity. He has symbolic capacity, but that is not capacity given by the United States. That's capacity given by other Iranians who say, well, maybe we should give the crown prince a chance. And in addition, of course, since the regime has completely cut Iran off from the world by not just cutting off the regular internet, but even blocking access to satellite internet like Starlink. It's not like the outside is able to beam in. So it's not like outside propaganda can be beamed in. But there's very limited outside access. What we are seeing is the reporting you get is from the ground, and that indicates that it is the Iranian people who shall we say are mad as hell with the ways that their lives have gone. And Will, I think what your listeners need to really understand is what is triggering this is ultimately desperation. In other words, when you're in a position where you cannot know, where you don't know where your next drink of water will come from, when you don't know where your next meal will come from, when you're not sure whether your children can afford housing, those are the issues. Remember, the protest began in the bazaar. It began with those petty merchants, the small merchants, who were not able to sell their goods because prices had spiked. The exchange rate is around, even unofficial figures. They talk about somewhere between 1.2 to 1.5 million Iranian riyals to $1. It is completely, and the government, yes, they tripled the subsidies. The subsidies they give the average Iranian per month is around $7 on the open market. You can't afford a meal. That's what's driving the protests. And of course, and so where the United States, what Trump has said is, of course, and the whole question is at some point Trump going to launch strikes to decapacitate the military and maybe decapitate the leadership so that the protesters get a chance? Because the difference, what is happening right now is the regime is armed. The protesters have essentially they don't have modern weapons. They can start fires, they can overturn vehicles, they can burn buildings, they can, by sheer numbers, push back the regime. But it is, of course, asymmetric.
Professor CHOKSY, I have two more questions before letting you go. No, let's talk about it. Donald Trump. We know that, again, 2026 is going to be rather crucial, especially for Trump, when we look at the midterm election. I mean, again, right. During the recent interview, that President Trump mentioned that Republicans or the GOP must stick to the core values. In other words, must win the midterm election. Because, again, Trump continued to hold on to this model. It's make America great again. But meanwhile, we know that the missile strikes, it's terrifying, not only for the citizens in Iran, but also outside Iran as well. Some experts believe that the missile strikes cannot make Iran great again. But at this moment, we are seeing the protests on the street. We're seeing the crumbling of the infrastructure. What about the missile development? And what about this hunger and the desire and the thirst for the current regime towards the missile development? What do you say about that?
And again, the development of ballistic missiles, this whole unresolved nuclear issue, it is an attempt by the regime to gain self-protection. So that they feel that then that way no outsider could possibly get involved, and then they can put down any internal dissent. If President Trump were to strike, he would be best advised to strike very carefully against the oppressors, not conduct a missile strike where the military is trying to push back the protesters, but maybe hit the military base, the military supply lines. In other words, give more breathing space and ability to the protesters. So that is one issue. The other question, of course, that has been bothering particularly the United States is, as you pointed out, Iran's own missile development. And certainly Trump may use this as an opportunity to attack Iran's missile development plans. Now, that, of course, won't help the protesters, but that will certainly reduce the regime's ability to intimidate neighboring states by having missiles. So that's where we stand. There's a sort of delicate balance about what one does to help the protesters, which is a lot harder than what one can do to prevent the regime from developing missiles. The regime can't use missiles against its own protesters. It uses regular conventional guns, etc. So the question is, that's the tough one. How do you push the regime back on the streets so the protesters can perhaps create a government of the people?
Professor CHOKSY, I want to end our conversation by going back to your amazing article. Again, the article, which is entitled, "The Iranian Regime Could Fall." We know that towards the end of the article that you mentioned there's no guarantee, there's no promise that the Iranian regime could fall. But I believe I'm saying this on behalf of our listeners and viewers. What would be the worst scenario if the protesters and the rioters were to succeed, and we're seeing the total political, economic transformation for the country? What would the picture look like? And also, how do we know that the current chaos would end very soon if US or President Trump were to jump in? Because again, we've seen how President Trump acted, or the administration acted, in the nation of Venezuela. We're not saying Venezuela is perfect at this moment, but that was the move, or that was the motivation to take out Nicolas Maduro. So for Iran, what would the picture look like? And how do we know that for this time, if US were to step in, that would be a whole new picture for the nation of Iran? Your final thoughts.
And I think that is the question that is being asked in the White House as well. That is, let us say the United States went in and essentially took out the supreme leader and the elites, the government, the corrupt elite of Iran. The question then is, yes, what comes next? And ultimately, in reality, we've seen this in Afghanistan, we've seen this in Iraq, we've seen this elsewhere. Ultimately, it comes down to the people of a country. No one from outside can stabilize a country if the people of the country are not willing to come together, work together to build their future. So yes, whether it is the people of Iran who chase out Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, or the United States that kills him or arrests him and takes him away, it is going to ultimately be up to the people of Iran to then come together, work together. Not the United States, not China, no one can do that. If the people of Iran fall apart among themselves with different factions fighting for power, as we saw happen in Iraq, there is nothing anyone else can do. And now, could that be worse than what we have now? Possibly. I think the Iranian people are gambling that if they oust their regime, that things will be better. In other words, they are so desperate that from their perspective, things could not get worse. From our outside perspective, we often look in and say, well, yes, it can get worse. I've often spoken to Iraqi colleagues and I've said, well, is Iraq better off now than when it was under Saddam Hussein? And they say Iraq has a lot of problems, but Iraq is better off now, despite all the problems, than it was under Saddam Hussein. And so I think that is we're seeing the people who are speaking ultimately are not President Trump, no other world leader. What we see in Iran right now is the people of Iran expressing their view that they want change either from the government that's in power or from someone else or other people in Iran. That I think what we see, and the question, of course, it may not succeed. Revolutions are not easy; they don't come easy.
That's right.
But the interesting thing is that the Iranian people have been trying. We've seen over the last decade constant outbreaks of rebellion, and each time they've gotten stronger. And the regime has had to resort to more and more violence. The question, I think, Will, that we should end on is, at what point is an army unwilling to shoot at its own people? Because if you and I start shooting, ultimately, we end up shooting our friends, our relatives. And so at what point does an army step back and say, we are no longer going to protect the regime. This is not something we created. I think that's the tipping point, is at what point do the enforcers say, look, we have to shoot our own wives, our own children who are also protesting. And it's at that point that regimes collapse.
Well, again, Professor CHOKSY, we don't know what the Trump administration will do, or to be precise, we don't know what President Trump will decide when we continue to pay attention to the chaos in Iran. But surely the one thing we're certain, the US is not going to sit there to watch it. And also China, Russia, Turkey, all those countries are not going to be bench players. So as we continue...
I agree with you completely. Let me just say this. I agree with you completely because particularly for, let's say, China and India, they cannot afford to be bench players because the regime in Iran is not just hurting Iranians, not just hurting Americans, they're hurting the average Chinese, the average Indian, because the average Chinese and the average Indian is dependent on Iranian oil. And the regime, the Iranian regime, is therefore hurting the average citizen of those countries.
There you go. So that's why we'll say in the 2026 this year, there are a lot more anticipations and expectations from the international community. And again, despite all the chaos and complications. Again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Professor JAMSHEED CHOKSY. Professor CHOKSY is a distinguished professor of Iranian and Central Eurasia Studies in the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies. And again, he's the co-author of this amazing article, which is called The Iranian Regime Could Fall, but a U.S. Strike Would Prop It Up. Well, Professor CHOKSY, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay closer attention to what's going to happen to the U.S. and Iran. So thank you so much for doing this.